G'day guys, so you've probably heard of the term transcontinental, meaning something that spans across multiple continents. Usually two, but it can sometimes be more. And sometimes countries can be considered transcontinental because the continents don't really have exact definitions. The most famous one would have to be Russia, because is it an Asian country or a European country? Some people say that the Ural Mountains divide Russia between Asia and Europe, but it's still one country and is still considered transcontinental. Now I want you to think, are there any others? Well, it might surprise you, there's actually lots. And I want to go over every single transcontinental country today. So starting off with countries that have territory in Asia and Europe. And we're going to go straight into it, Russia. So the term Asia and Europe can sometimes be considered Eurasia as one whole continent. And in terms of Russia, they like to use this term. But this means that this part of Russia in Siberia over here is sort of considered the Asian part. But then if you go over here where Moscow and St. Petersburg are, it's more European and it's more of a cultural divide rather than a geographical divide, because the Ural Mountains, wherever they are, somewhere around here, they basically divide the country geographically, but there's no oceans or anything like that that divides continents normally. And in that same vein, Russia also has these three countries underneath: Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia. There's this map here that sort of shows where the line people have kind of drawn historically is. Through Istanbul, where there's the river here that splits Istanbul east and west, this river is usually considered the border between Europe and Asia. But that means that this side of the river is Europe and this side of the river is Asia, which doesn't really make sense because both sides of the city are still just the same country, same people, and not that much different culturally. But you gotta draw the line somewhere, right? And that's where they draw it down here. But where do they draw it? Here. What's interesting is historically people agree that the border is this mountain range right here. So on this map, you can see that the top of Georgia and then this part of Azerbaijan. If we can see the map just here, this mountain range cuts through here, means that this side of Azerbaijan is Europe and well, this side is Asia, which seems silly because there's a tiny part, and it even sounds more silly with the Georgian side. But as you can see, this mountain range is considered the border, but there is tiny parts of Georgia up here that are kind of considered European, while this part is considered Asia. Anyway, they're transcontinental, and this part of the Caucasus is really interesting area because it's sort of the bridge between Europe and Asia culturally. Now, Kazakhstan's also interesting because this is considered to be Europe and Asia hybrid as well. The western part of Kazakhstan is technically considered European, because if we can see on this border, this is where the Ural Mountains sort of finish, I guess, and there's this small part here which sort of cuts into the border of Russia, which is, I guess, considered Europe. If we consider the European and Asian sides of Russia, then we have to do the same with Kazakhstan. So Kazakhstan is also considered transcontinental the same way Russia is. Right, so that's all the countries that are considered transcontinental with Europe and Asia. But now let's change continents. So we can see here, Egypt is very clearly in Africa, right? This is the African continent, but Egypt also has this part, which is part of Asia. This is the Sinai Peninsula, which is next to Israel and Jordan and Gaza and all that. And then we've got the Suez Canal, which has been man-made, but it's usually considered the border between Africa and Asia. So this part is basically not part of the continent of Africa, but it's still part of Egypt. Now, another interesting country that's considered European and African, which you might not think about, is Yemen. Now, Yemen is this country right here, which is on the end of the Arabian Peninsula, which is part of the Middle East, but for most definitions, this is considered part of Asia still. And if we consider that, that means that this island right here, which actually is part of the African continent, is part of Yemen. So because Socotra, and has a really interesting landscape, is part of Yemen, it means that Yemen also has land in Africa. So some islands can make it a little bit tricky to differentiate what continent these countries are on, but in this case, Yemen has land in Africa apparently. Now let's move on to a different part of the world, North and South America. Now North America is usually considered Canada, United States, Mexico, and then this is Central America. But if you don't consider Central America its own area, continent, it's actually part of North America, which means that all of these countries are part of North America. And the Caribbean islands, well, where are they? Are they North or South American? That's kind of where the debate comes in, but usually the dividing line is actually between the Panama Canal. Kind of like the Suez Canal over in Egypt, where it's man-made and it's been cut, but the Panama Canal is usually the dividing line, which is right here. So the canal goes through here, which means, misleadingly, that this side is North America and this side is South America, which is kind of funny because this side is more north than this side, but it's because of the way that the landmass moves. But Panama is considered a transcontinental country because of that. Now, some cultures do make North and South America just America as a continent. The way I was growing up, and I think a lot of the Western world also considers this North and South America. So we're going to go with that definition for this video. And because of this, it makes the border really tricky, because if we consider this part of the Caribbean North America and this part South America or something like that, we have to include all of the islands. So Colombia actually has a bunch of tiny islands up in here, which usually we'd consider Colombia to be South America, but there's these islands here which are part of Colombian land, and they're closer to Nicaragua over here, which means that, well, I guess they're considered North American. But Colombia is a transcontinental country. And in that same vein, Venezuela right next door, there's some islands over here which are part of Venezuela just over here. Now these are kind of considered North American just because the whole Caribbean is considered North America, so that means these islands in Venezuela are considered North American too. Now another way of distinguishing continents is based on the tectonic plates and where they sit. Now there's a Caribbean tectonic plate and then there's a South American tectonic plate. Trinidad and Tobago, this country right here, technically this part of Trinidad, or just Trinidad, is considered part of the South American plate, and then this part, which is Tobago, the smaller island, is part of the Caribbean plate. So Trinidad is cut through here based on the tectonic plates of the continental definition. Now depending on that definition, there could be lots more continents. Kind of makes sense if we're considering the Caribbean plate of the tectonic plate to be North American, so therefore Trinidad has to be transcontinental as well. Now we're going to switch over back to my home country, Australia. Now we're going to talk about transcontinental countries between Asia and Oceania. Now there's lots of definitions of what Australia is. If Australia is its own continent, Oceania is its own continent, it doesn't really matter. Basically Australia has a bit of territory in Asia, in Christmas Island, Cocos Islands, and there's some other smaller islands around here considered not oceanic purely because they're not part of the three areas, which basically Oceania consists of Melanesia, Polynesia, and Micronesia, as well as the Australasian plate, which is Australia and New Zealand. So it's a little bit rough, but that's the definition we're going to go with here. And in that vein, which Papua New Guinea is kind of part of Asia if this island is part of Oceania. There's not really a definition. However, Papua New Guinea and Indonesia, this island, which is just called Papua, is considered Asian and Oceanic just because this island is a lot more closely related to Australasian and Melanesian cultures. And if we consider Papua New Guinea part of Asia, well, that means Bougainville, which is part of the Solomon Islands, is part of Oceania. So either way you spin it, both these countries are transcontinental. Same with Timor-Leste. There's some tiny islands in Timor-Leste that are considered more part of the Australian plate and therefore part of Oceania as well. And their cultures do align more with Melanesia, just like this island Papua over here. Now finally, a really interesting one is these Japanese islands, which are in more oceanic territory, just like around Palau and Guam. These islands are considered oceanic, but Japan is obviously part of Asia. So if we include these islands in Oceania, then Japan is also considered transcontinental as well. Now we're going to go back over to Africa and Europe, because there's two countries that have parts in Africa and Europe. Now starting off easy is Spain, where they actually have territory in the part of Morocco that's on the coast. So the first one is right here, which this part is considered to be part of Spain, which is really interesting. There's a whole history behind it. I won't get into this video. Now where's the other part? I believe it's here. Yeah, so there's this part right here that is technically the shortest border between two countries. This is a really interesting peninsula because this whole part is part of Spain. It's basically just a military base, but there's a lot of fortification over this. And Morocco, it's just a whole weird situation, but this is technically part of Spain, and that means Spain has land in Africa. Two parts actually. Now this part gets a bit hazy because there's parts of Italy that are considered African. There's these islands here, here, and here. Now, if these islands are part of Africa, which they're very small and are quite uninhabited, but these islands are Italian, and this land here is closer to Tunisia than it is to Italy, meaning that technically it should be part of Africa maybe, but does that mean Malta's part of Africa? Well, it's not. Malta's part of Europe. So these islands are technically part of Africa, so that makes Italy transcontinental as well. But, you know, you be the judge. And instead of Europe and Africa, now there's actually a country that is Europe and North America, which is Denmark. Because Denmark has land in North America, Greenland. Greenland is owned by Denmark, if you didn't know, and Greenland is considered to be part of North America. More specifically, the northern part of North America, where it's with Canada, and technically it has a border. Now, there's an island somewhere. I'm not entirely sure which one it is, but one of these islands right up here, I believe it's this one. Here we go. Greenland and Canada have a border. Now, I'll just change it to this land, but as you can see, this island here has a bit of a dispute and they eventually decided to actually make it a border. So that means that this part is Greenland or Denmark, so this is European, but also part of North America. And then this part is also North America because it's Canada. So really interesting border just there, right up in the north, very inaccessible to get to. Not sure if anyone's ever been there, but Greenland is definitely part of North America, and because it's part of Denmark, that makes Denmark transcontinental. Okay, so now we're going to get into countries that have 3 continents, and there's not many of them. Basically, the first one is the Netherlands. Netherlands, first off, has the Netherlands in Europe. Then it has these 3 islands, Aruba, Curacao, and Bonaire, which are the ABC islands, which are considered South America because they're closer to the mainland here. They're not part of the Caribbean so much. But then there is islands here, which, there's too many islands. Here we go, Saint Martin and Sint Maarten. So the northern part is part of France and the southern part is part of the Netherlands. I made a whole video about why this happens, but basically this part right here is the Netherlands, meaning that there's Dutch land in the Caribbean, which we established is North American. So 3 continents there. Now another interesting country that you might not think of is Portugal, having 3 continents. Now there's these islands down here that are part of Africa, but they're also part of Portugal. If you click on here, it says Portugal right here. But this part is geographically closer to Morocco, so technically it's part of Africa. I don't know. There's some of these that are a bit hazy, but these islands right here are part of Africa. Oh, and there's also these islands here that are part of Spain. However, we already established that Spain has actual land in Africa, and these islands are just more of Spanish territory. But Portugal has Africa, but Portugal also has North America. Now, these islands right here are kind of a bit debatable what continent they're on because they're just in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. But technically, these islands are part of the North American tectonic plate, which is a bit of a stretch, but the tectonic plate basically stretches all the way around here. As you can see, it stretches all the way out here, and there's these tiny islands actually in here. So it goes over the top of the Caribbean and then scoops up just these islands right here. So if we're going off the tectonic plate definition, then yeah, Portugal's transcontinental with 3 countries too. Now the United States. Now this one's pretty obvious. We've got United States in North America. We've got Hawaii, which is usually considered Oceania, but then we also have Guam just here. This is considered Asian. Now there is a few other islands around here that America sort of takes control over just for military bases and stuff like that. They are in Asian water and also part of the Asian tectonic plates. So technically they're part of that, but just because Hawaii's there, there's actually Samoa, which has this part right here, American Samoa. So American Samoa is not its own country. This is actually part of America. And if Samoa is part of Oceania, then so is this. We've got countries that have 5 continents. This is a bit of a stretch again, but basically France is one of them because there's Europe. Then they've got French Guiana, which is a massive area in South America. Then in North America, there's a part up here, Saint Pierre and Miquelon, which is also part of France, not part of Canada. Then if we go down here, next to Madagascar, there's Reunion, which this island is part of France still. And there's also a part over here, Mayotte, which is part of France. And then if we go over to Oceania, there's New Caledonia and also there's French Polynesia. So they've got a lot of land everywhere. France spans across all of the continents except for Asia. But finally, the big one. There's one country that spans across all 7 continents, and that is, well, the colonizer themselves, United Kingdom. The United Kingdom has land in every single continent, and I'm going to explain how. Right, so this is the easiest way to visualize all of the UK's land that they currently still own. So there's a few islands in the Caribbean, which is North America and South America. This one right here would be Bermuda, which is considered North America. Then they've got a few islands in the Caribbean, very small tax havens like Turks and Caicos and the Cayman Islands. Then they've got the Pitcairn Islands over here, which is part of Oceania. The Falkland Islands, which is considered to be South America. Same with the South Georgia Sandwich Islands. There's a few other islands which are considered African territory, which is St. Helena and Ascension. Then they got the British Indian Ocean territory, which is right here, which is more considered African, but can also be considered Asian, so that's kind of transcontinental in itself, because Mauritius sort of claims it at the moment, and they're thinking of giving it back. That's a whole thing, but basically that's owned by them as well. And they also have a claim in Antarctica, which I didn't really want to get into because it doesn't really count with a lot of these continents, and there is a lot of countries that do claim both continents. But yeah, basically that's every transcontinental country. Let me know if you can think of any others, but that's basically all of the ones that have a proper definition of transcontinental and ones that most people can agree on. Let me know your thoughts on this. But anyway, thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.